Morning guys, talking about the Formula 1 news. The dust has settled from the first day in Abu Dhabi, and of the three title rivals, it is Lando Norris who is the most satisfied, topping both practice sessions. Max Verstappen believing his car certainly needs to find another gear tomorrow if he wants any chance of being competitive this weekend. But Oscar Piastri with a difficult day, missing the first free practice session. The second one was rather off the pace, especially with all these rumours circulating today that McLaren have changed their approach this weekend and will potentially favour one driver as a result over the other. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Let's begin here because yesterday they did the annual tradition. They get all the drivers together. Thought this is all rather nice. Apparently it was Pierre Gasly who picked up the bill this time. I believe that Liam Lawson said that today, and people, of course, you know what people are like, trying to guess what the seating arrangement might have been. Whatever. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. Hamilton did have some comments on Yuki. Today was a challenging day for Tsunoda on a weekend where Tsunoda would really like to, and Max would really like Yuki to play a role in the title battle, get up there ideally with some of the top contenders, or at least have some sort of pace so that if required, Yuki could do the Perez from 2021. And I would be very surprised if that isn't the strategy that Red Bull put Tsunoda on. Go out on the hard tyres, stay out there as long as you possibly can, and then try to hold up Lando after he's done his pit stop, right? That could well be the plan. We shall see if that would even work, because can Yuki hold up Lando in that type of scenario on older tyres? Well, not on the pace that he had today. It is also the final potentially ever weekend, although I wouldn't be shocked if DRS comes back at some point, of DRS. So from 2011 we've had the drag reduction system. Next year it will disappear. The cars are going to be rather different. Active aerodynamics, the 50%, 45%, but basically the hybrid is going to be such an important part, the electrical components and the regeneration and everything. The drivers don't think that overtaking is going to be a problem next year with all of that considered, but Hamilton did make some interesting comments yesterday and said the way these cars are, the lack of downforce, the massive amount of torque they now have as well, given the electrical component has been increased drastically, means they are going to be incredibly challenging to race in the wet, is what Hamilton said, which I thought was kind of interesting given that we don't do much wet racing anyway, and Hamilton saying that next year the cars are not really designed to work that well in wet conditions. It will be a challenge, that is for sure. Let's talk about free practice one before we talk about the McLaren drama and certainly the reaction then for many of the drivers. A ton of rookies in the cars today. We saw Arthur Leclerc in the other Ferrari, Hamilton's Ferrari in the first session. Verstappen thought it was pretty funny. The GP was calling him Leclerc Jr. There was other talk about Big Leclerc being Charles. Kian Shields was in the Aston Martin. They had both Aston Martins to rookie drivers. Fair play. They didn't finish in the wall, but yeah, there will have been a lot of money exchanged, let's just say, for that one. There was also this moment. Here is Oscar Piastri sitting on the pit wall. So we have known now for a good 6 weeks, probably 8 weeks really, ever since Mexico, and we knew what the plan was for Mexico, that Piastri wasn't going to be stepping out of his seat. It was always set to be necessary for Piastri to step out during the first free practice session. Here he is on the pit wall, realising that he's been caught. Thought that was pretty funny, sitting in Zach Brown's seat and missing the first session. Of course, never ideal on a weekend when you're fighting for the championship, and it's pretty clear that because of that, he did lose at least some bit of ground today, especially if the rumours are true about what McLaren are doing right now behind the scenes in terms of sharing data. We'll get back to that in the coming minutes. But it was Pato O'Ward in the McLaren instead of Oscar Piastri for this one. There was nearly a bit of a coming together here between Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. As soon as you saw it at the top of the screen, right, when it was like impeding Verstappen Norris, I think my initial reaction was, oh, here we go, right? The mind games continue. I don't think this was intentional by Max at all, or for GP. GP thought that Lando wasn't starting a hot lap, but actually he was. So, okay, mistakes were made. It is what it is. Max just about gets out the way in time. So I don't think there was anything intentional or malicious here, but it was certainly interesting, right, to see of all the impeding moments, and there were some other impeding moments, to be fair. Hadjar wasn't very happy with Browning, but for it to be of at least the pro drivers, as it were, or the real contenders, for it to happen to be Max and Lando to get into it in turn one, maybe a sign of things to come over the rest of the weekend. So the session concludes. Lando was P1 by a smidge. Max looked pretty fast, but it's worth saying that how representative really is this when you've got Charles Leclerc within 16 thousandths of Lando? I'm not expecting the Ferrari to be a huge factor this weekend. Leclerc, though, did ask. He was like, are we just slow? And he was getting told, actually, we're not that slow, at least in terms of long-run pace compared to the rivals. That would change, to be fair, as the day went on. I will get back to that in a second. But Lando tops the first practice session. It was incredibly close with Max. Max looked really good for some time. But of course, dusty first session much earlier in the day than qualifying is going to happen tomorrow with the lower track temperatures. So FP2 was definitely more representative. We can see where the respective drivers finished. Hirakawa did a pretty good job in the Haas. We know that, of course, Japanese driver. And for those not that familiar with Hirakawa might think, okay, rookie, done pretty well compared to Bem and only a couple of tenths off. Maybe he could be a talent, right? Japanese driver. They've got the Toyota Gazoo Racing thing with Haas going forwards. We discussed it with respect to Tsunoda over the last couple of days. But Hirakawa is 31, right? So, he's not coming into F1 anytime soon, I would not imagine. Another number of names further down the list that you will recognise, I'm sure. Speaking of Ferrari, there was an interesting thing noted today, which is a different steering wheel. I don't think we've seen too much of this. This is the older steering wheel here at the bottom, and you can see at the top, while the logos and stuff are pretty much the same, the design is notably different, and it seems that they're trying a couple of things. And there was even a tweet here from Rosalia Giuliana talking about it as well, some of the changes they're looking to make on the steering wheel going forwards. So pretty interesting. Apparently taking some inspiration from their hypercar wheel. That's at least what we see so far. We know that Lewis Hamilton, famously the way that the steering wheels are generally designed nowadays was inspired by Hamilton's thoughts and opinions for McLaren when he first came into the sport. So Hamilton absolutely will have his preferences on the way that the Ferrari steering wheel is designed. Maybe those are one of the notes that he has made in these massive lists of documents that he's put together apparently this season for Ferrari to say, hey, this is problematic in some regard, and I think we should change it. Maybe that's just a necessity of next year's regulations, the active aero and some other things. It may make sense to redesign it in that scenario, but also I'd imagine that Hamilton and Leclerc would have certainly given their insight, and I wonder whether we will see other changes to other teams as time goes forward. But let's talk about the big drama, right? Because, again, at McLaren, the question is, are they going to do team orders? Are they favouring one driver over the other? What exactly is going on? Now, the rumour yesterday emerged out of the Aussie press that McLaren were preventing Piastri talking to any of the Aussie media, presumably in their opinion because he would spill the beans or whatever on the massive internal bias that maybe they think is happening at McLaren. Look, everyone's got their opinion on this, but apparently McLaren had actually just banned them talking to anyone. They didn't want the questions from every single journalist about team orders, papaya rules, and I totally get it. But what was interesting is that yesterday we talked about, the drivers said in the press conferences, we've not discussed anything with regard to team orders, what that would mean. And that was a bit of a surprise to me because I'm sure that they would have to have the conversation. So either they hadn't discussed it then, but now they have, or what they said yesterday wasn't true. But Zach Brown basically said, yeah, we have talked about it. And this is the case. If we get into the race and it is becoming pretty clear that one has a chance and the other doesn't, we are going to do what we can to win the Drivers' Championship. It would be crazy not to. So that's the statement from Zach Brown. Now, of course, the way that this reads is almost as if, the drivers are like, I don't know, level on points or something, and one is way out of the picture, but maybe he can hold up Max for a couple of laps after a pit stop, or whatever the case is. But the reality is, of course, that when he says if one has a chance and the other doesn't, that obviously means Lando, right? Because if he's 16 points ahead of Oscar, so there's not going to be a scenario where they're going to call team orders on Lando to help out Oscar, right? It would only ever be the other way around, so that's worth bearing in mind. Look, team orders are a thing. I think if you're McLaren and you're in the position where Piastri is, let's say, second or third, and Lando is fourth and really needs that extra position, then it's a choice, right? Either Max wins or Lando wins. Piastri's not in the picture at that point. Unless, of course, there is the hypothetical that says, well, what if Piastri finishes the race in third, doesn't yield to Lando in fourth, Max wins the championship, but then Max is disqualified from the race. Now, in that scenario, Piastri would gain 7 points on Lando, but that wouldn't be enough because he's 16 points behind. So, effectively, if Max were to get disqualified, because some people are saying, oh, well, you know, you never want to give up position just in case Max gets disqualified. But actually, the only way that that would help Piastri is if Lando also got disqualified. Now, there's not, I will say it's not impossible, right? Like, there is a 0.1% chances of that happening. But, you know, hypothetically, Piastri could yield position to, you know, a couple of drivers potentially, where he maybe yields position to Russell and to somebody else and then to Lando, and that helped him out or whatever to help Lando win because it's becoming clear Max is going to win. But then both Norris and Verstappen get disqualified after the race, and then Piastri only gains 15 points rather than 18 or something, and then he loses the title to Lando anyway, whereas he would have won it. You know, there are these incredible edge case scenarios where Oscar yielding, you know, it may work out that he ends up losing when he would have won. But the chances of that, given that the point standings that we have, are infinitesimally small, right? So that's not really a thought process. The question becomes, towards the end of the race, if it's becoming clear one thing is going to happen. Zak Brown says, look, we will do team orders to win the title, right? That's what he says. Because yesterday they kind of denied that. And Lando said he wouldn't ask for it. And Oscar said, well, I haven't been asked about it. But Zak Brown now says, look, if necessary, we will effectively employ team orders on Oscar to make Lando win, which is absolutely not a shock at all, and is what McLaren were frankly always going to do. Now, people will have their thoughts on that as to whether that would be fair or not, and it may not be necessary based on the evidence that we have seen today anyway, especially because of this, right? So Piastri missed the first free practice session. That is a lack of time in the car. That is a lack of data, right? So Norris's side of the garage has more data, more setup data, and we know it's been a very common feature of the season that one of these two guys will be struggling. They will speak to the other side of the garage, the engineers will share data, and they will use the data from how Norris is tackling these corners, what Norris's setup is to help Piastri, or the other way around, depending on who's good on that particular weekend in the early part of the Friday. But there was a report from Racing News 365 that actually for this weekend and this weekend only, they're stopping that to allow the two drivers to properly battle for the championship. They are having separate technical briefings, and at each team's hospitality, they will not be sharing any setup data. Now, look, if this is true, it's a very interesting time to do it, right? Especially because it theoretically only really favours Lando, because Lando had the extra session, right? He had the extra FP1 session, so if there was any weekends that Piastri could really do with that setup data, this would be the weekends. But, you know, conveniently on the championship decided it's not happening. So immediately, of course, people took and ran with this. I don't know 100% if this is actually true, though, or not, because, well, I couldn't find the article associated with this. I asked GPT to find it for me, and it summarized it as follows. We've just discussed that, basically, that they'll do their technical briefings in various different rooms and all that stuff. But when you go to find the article now, it's now been deleted. It's not there anymore. And there was actually another article that came out yesterday when Oscar Piastri said that, well, he joked around and said, we're going to put a cardboard barrier between the two of us, but no, it's the same as usual. Basically, they're not doing it, right? So that's what this article says, is that they are still going to share information, despite pretty much, what do they say here? Piastri confirms that he and Norris will continue to share data as normal across the event. No changes will be made to how the team operates. So that's one Racing News 365 article from yesterday. Then there was another one, I think from today, that suggested that it was not true, but now that article's been deleted. So I'm not really sure what exactly is the case. But the bottom line is, whether they're sharing data or not, it's not been an ideal start to the weekend for Oscar Piastri. So let's get into free practice 2 and some of the race data as well, which is particularly interesting. Behrman was delighted with the Haas, right? And look, if Behrman ever gets to go to Ferrari, you can imagine that this wide smile that he has on his face at some point is going to get wiped off. But it's great to see what Haas have done this year. He says, wow, this car is so good. Like, what are you doing, right? How is it so good? On the other side of things, Charles Leclerc is getting told that Lando was doing a 29.1 on the long runs. Leclerc was about a second off that, and he was like, give me the other guys, please. I don't care what Lando's doing. My God, I cannot possibly go that fast. So we got the soft tyre running done. But what was interesting was that Piastri was, well, struggling. He struggled on pretty much all the sectors. Then he bolted on, made a small setup tweak, bolted on a fresh set of the soft tyres, and, well, he had a big lock-up in the middle sector, which cost him a good few tenths of a second. But even outside of that, it's not like he was right on the ball. So Norris put in a really good lap, 1:23.0. Max was 3.5 tenths off that. Most of that is in the final sector. It's a tricky final sector under the hotel, lots of kind of lower speed corners. Look, the reality is, at Abu Dhabi, whether you like the circuit or not, it has a lot of variation, right? There's high speed, there's long straights, there's medium speed, there's slow speed pretty much as well. So and there's a chicane, obviously, at the end of, well, the middle of sector 2 at the end of the first long straight. So it does test the extremes of the car. I'm not expecting there to be a surprise team that, like, really mix it up. For example, Aston Martin in certain conditions, if it's a really high downforce track, they can be competitive. In other conditions, maybe Williams or maybe Ferrari even, right? And maybe Sauber, I don't know, like, we'll see. But it should be a track where the best cars shine, really, and because there's so much compromise that needs to be made. So I'm not expecting a team to kind of come out of nowhere and really be in the picture. The question for certainly Oscar and Max will be, can George Russell and Kimi Antonelli come to the party? Because if they can, then the opportunity is there. If they can't, then, as we know, Lando can finish third and still be champion regardless. These were the best sector times. Norris was a 10th clear of anyone in Sector 1. He wasn't the fastest in Sector 2 because they are running more downforce on that McLaren than the Red Bull is, so he was a 10th down in the middle sector, but then he gained 3 tenths on Max in the final sector alone. Now, worth noting, of course, Piastri had that, he didn't have a good middle sector, he was way down the order. But even Piastri's best first and third sectors would still have put him about 3 tenths off where Lando was. So, Lando was in a bit of a different postcode today, and that wouldn't be a massive surprise, right? Piastri is a good track for Lando. We know that historically he dominated around here last year in the Grand Prix as well. Piastri missed the first practice session. So, look, Lando comes into this weekend. If there were no championship implications, Lando would be favourite for this Grand Prix. I think you would absolutely argue. But with the championship as it is, the pressure's on, as we know, but Norris seems to be handling it reasonably well so far. The long-run data is fascinating. Again, standard, let's say, caveats here in terms of engine mode, fuel load. We just don't really know. And also worth pointing out, Max's stint was substantially longer than Lando's was. So Lando did only 8 laps, Verstappen did 15. You can see the amount of degradation that Verstappen suffered here towards the end of the stint. But his opening few laps were pretty similar to Lando's, really. But again, you can see Lando's lap times were monstrously and pretty effortlessly consistent. He was targeting a 1:29.4 or something, 1:29.4, and he was just banging in those laps, lap after lap, which shows that the car is in a good spot and well balanced. Because, you look at cars that are less well balanced and you tend to find a lot more variation in those lap times. And obviously Verstappen was keeping up maybe for about 8, 9, 10 laps, and then his pace started to drop off. Would that have been the same for Lando if he'd have had a longer stint? Those are questions that we don't know the answer to. When you look at it from the top level, Piastri only did 6 laps on his. So, again, right, Lando was definitely the class of the field. I know that Hadjar did a few laps on the softs, but, all things considered, Max and Lando, they looked like the strongest out there, and with Max, you consider the extra laps that he did. I think that was reasonably competitive still for Red Bull, but probably not enough. And you can overtake around Abu Dhabi. Absolutely, that is possible. And as a result, especially with the new layout that we have today, so Max and Red Bull even said this. Laura McKee said that race pace is critical this weekend. Of course, they are thinking about qualifying, and qualifying is key, but maybe not as much as it was, let's say, back in Qatar. So, a couple of comments on the drivers. Max says, not quick enough. he wasn't absolutely incredibly downbeat about it. He said, still not quick enough. I was fairly happy with the car. We probably need to be a bit faster. Overall, we've been in a decent window, but both the single lap and the long run needs to be better. There's a decent gap we've got to close. We'll see how much we can find overnight. And Yuki was nowhere really. So again, I think Red Bull can make some improvements. I think they were reasonably competitive today, but yeah, Lando was on a bit of a different planet. And as Helmut Marko says, we're not in a very comfortable situation and we lost time, especially in Sector 3, but we have had worse Fridays and done better with it, right? So yeah, we'll see, right? Can they fix their Sector 3? That's going to be the key compromise they may have to make with their setup overnight. If they can, I think they can be closer. I have a tough time believing that the Red Bull will become the fastest car overnight. But again, then it comes down to execution in qualifying. And we know that Max Verstappen will find every last bit, or at least he will try. Whereas Lando, there is, more to lose, of course, but equally, he doesn't need to put in the most stellar lap of his career. P3 is enough. And I think from the Max Verstappen and Oscar Piastri perspective, they will be really hoping that somebody else can get into the mix, and we'll discuss what George had to say in a second. Lando says, from the times, things are looking good, but I still want a bit more from the car. So I think Lando's got the right mentality this weekend so far. Max says, we'll see what we can find overnight. Lando says, I still want a bit more in the car. We're trying some things. Hopefully we can find a little bit more. It's been a positive day, but nothing to smile about just yet. Oscar Piastri, of course, finishing P11, 7/10 off where Lando was. Of course, their lockup in the middle sector didn't help that, but still, he wasn't quite there in any of the sectors. But he says after one session, it's not too bad. The cars looked quick, need to find my feet a bit more. So just not ideal really on a weekends where he missed that first free practice session. But again, look, that's his own decision, right? He chose when he was going to take the free practice sessions off. Lando chose to do his a little while ago at this point. So these were Lando's kind of full comments. We've pretty much gone through all of those at this point. He was asked, does he think it's an advantage, the fact that he got that free practice session? Lando said, absolutely not. George Russell was asked as well. His race pace, as we saw in the data a couple of seconds ago, I'll just go back to it real quick if you guys didn't look at the Mercedes. I mean, we didn't pay much attention to them really. But yeah, Russell, Antonelli, they were 129.8, 130 low. So, that's kind of where Leclerc and Hamilton were in that ballpark really as well. Hamilton was, again, some inconsistent. I think he probably pushed a bit hard on his first one and then cooked the tyres. Doesn't seem like much of a surprise there. So, yeah, the Mercedes in long run pace weren't really in the mix. And that will be a concern for not just Mercedes trying to win the Grand Prix, but also for the title contenders, right? Because this is great news for Lando. Let's say Lando messes up his qualifying lap tomorrow, ends up 4th or 5th, and he's got the two Mercedes ahead of him. If their race pace is terrible, then, Lando should be able to get past, get into 3rd, and still hold on. Of course, that won't be Lando's plan, but for Piastri and Verstappen, they really need Mercedes, I think, because I can't see any other team doing it, really. I think they need Mercedes to be competitive. Today, that was not really the case. And Max says, the car's in an okay window. We've got to close the gap. Maybe there's some hope for Ferrari, but Hamilton was told, look, Lewis, that was your last ever Friday you have to do in this car. And he said, thank God, I'm feeling thankful. So very much to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.